John 14:6 says, Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father except through me. What does that mean to liberalism?
Not a lot.
Right.
First, I think it's worth clarifying. We're going to use that word a lot, and that's kind of what the whole thing is about. And at the outset, before there is any confusion, misconception, whatever, we are not talking about the American political dynamic when we use the word liberalism or liberal or whatever. Not to say that that word doesn't apply there, but that's in a completely separate context, whereas when you're dealing with the political philosophy of liberalism, what Americans call conservative and liberal are both liberal in that sense.
Yeah, everything could be liberal.
So we're not talking about a specific group of people within this or that political dynamic. We're talking about the socio-political dynamic of the West in general and the underlying philosophy there. And unfortunately, it is a underlying political philosophy that has very little to do concretely with the gospel. And in many cases, it is oriented against the gospel, if arguably, at least many cases, assuming that it's not just across the board a anti-Christian foundation that unfortunately large swaths of Christians have taken as the given.
Yeah.
Rather than an option.
We can basically call that one little L liberalism, and then big L liberalism I have is a movement in the church that wanted to reground the faith with alternatives like science, logic, and social justice, downplaying core doctrines. So just to get that out of the way.
Just to avoid that confusion.
Right. Okay. Do you want to take the definition of liberalism? Or?
Well, I mean, I don't have to.
Do we want to apply a definition to something before we talk?
I mean, absolutely. There's, in my experience, there are different definitions depending on the application. So, if you can speak of liberalism in a uniquely political context, as in like literally the organization and distribution of power politically. You can speak of it as a cultural standard for general civic engagement, which would include the political side and also the social side. That's the not explicitly structured patterns and traditions of how people engage with authority and with one another and all that good stuff. And I think that largely coincides with some of the stuff that are sort of baked into liberalism, because we talked about last time how liberalism is kind of the container that delivered things like modernity / postmodernity and capitalism / consumer capitalism into basically use those as markers for the world that Protestantism was brought into. And I also think it's worth mentioning outright, there's kind of two ways to think about those ideas' relationship to one another, which is Protestantism. Some would look at Martin Luther as the father of liberalism and modernity as we know it. Others, you would argue, Martin Luther latched onto existing ideas and just sort of basically tilled the soil of the religious mind in late medieval, early modern Europe. And rather than being the source of these ideas, he just introduced them and basically separated where there was a divide previously between church and faith and like these other, or whether rather, completely wrong, where there was previously no divide between my political experience and my interpersonal experience and my faith. Luther opened the door for a Christian expression of liberal ideals. And that worldview sees this thing of modernity beginning with the discovery of the New World. So 1492 comes around, and this shift from what was common thought prior to the discovery of the New World, that discovery introduces all these tensions that give way to what we would call modernity, and which puts Luther 20 to 30 years of discussion around these topics, picking them up and carrying them into his religious critique of the Catholic Church, which is a whole nother mess because he was not the most consistent, easy to follow guy in terms of what his thoughts actually were. But either one you take, either Luther is the source of these ideas that get carried forward in the Protestant Reformation, or he is a step in the unfolding of liberal ideas. Just, he is the religious step. He is the step where previously these ideas did not have access to the Christian life because there was a clear standard of what was intrinsic and what was like a necessity for being a Christian and what was not. But then the subjectivism that is innate in liberalism and the individualism that is innate there, it changes that. And it puts me in a position where everything is up to be questioned or resented, and the degree to which I question it or refuse to submit to something doesn't necessarily play a role in my identity related things. So I can be what has normally been required to call myself a Christian for 1,500 years. I can call every single one of those things into question and retain my identity as a Christian.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like the bird's eye view of the relationship between liberalism and Christianity. And I think there's also a degree culturally, because liberalism does speak more directly to the political side, what we would call modernity as directly opposing the standard for Christian life on the individual level and at the group level.
Yeah, there's a quote that says, "A Protestant may freely range from one end of the spectrum to the other and still be considered orthodox according to Protestant estimation."
Yeah.
It's like, well, that is literally what happened. And that's what you were talking about. I want to talk about the Enlightenment core principles from liberalism. There's like 5 of them. There's probably way more, but just 5 that I highlighted. And it does start with individualism, which everybody knows. If you listened last time, my problems with individualism, but individualism is the individual, not the collective or state, is the basic unit of society possessing inherent rights. So basically, anyone heard how the church is not a building, but it's the people? Like, you hear that all the time in non-denominational. But it's ironic that the sign reads blank church, but somehow I'm supposed to believe that the church isn't necessarily a building, but it's just people.
Right.
While your sign says Antioch Church or Family Church or First Baptist Church. I just think that's ironic. We do make up the body of believers, but Jesus was not against the building. Obviously, we see him reading scriptures in the synagogue, so it's like he's not against church as a whole.
Right.
And we also see the liberal idea that we don't need church. I need myself.
Right.
But it's also because we've given access to everything outside of the church that somebody would find in church in Protestantism.
Right.
Like you have the music on your own, you have the sermons, you have everything. You have online church.
Right.
But it's like, there's no really reason other than the body for a Protestant to go to church. The body as in the body of believers, not the physical body. So I kind of see their point with that individual. I mean, I talked to you about that. It's like, if you're going to church and you are alone and you are leaving and not talking to anybody, it's like, that's what people go to church for. They go for the body. You can access everything else outside the body. It's the only time you meet with the body of believers, unless you're in a small group or something like that, but on that capacity. But as far as individualism goes, it's a nightmare now, because we see the group Like throughout history, we can point back to group activities, the church meeting.
Yeah.
It's like all of a sudden we've come to this conclusion that we can do it on our own, which has never been the case at all. But like I said, if you have access to everything, then why would you need to?
Yeah. Yeah, I think a theme and just a feature of Protestantism in general, and even more so in what some people would prefer to call evangelicalism. And I've met all sorts of people who would prefer to completely categorize as separate from one another Protestantism and evangelicalism, which we kind of talked about in the last episode of like the moving from modernity to post-modernity, or liberalism to neoliberalism. But that movement was not, it had very little to do with anything external. It was a doubling down on the things that were already present in Protestantism. And I think some might think of it as a side effect. I think if you really draw a clear line through the movements that Protestantism was making philosophically, it's the movement of things that were already intrinsic at the beginning. And so when I look at the relationship between evangelicalism and Protestantism, I'm not looking at a third party getting involved in creating this foreign thing. I'm looking at a more strict adherence to the grounding principles and then leading them somewhere I don't want to go. And even part of that process is baked into liberalism, like the movement where I am content with how far I've gone, someone else isn't, and they go further down the road I was already going, and then I go, not valid, like that's not. And it's almost strictly, I can't make any logical or circumstantial argument as to why they're wrong, because they're doing the same thing I'm doing, just they didn't stop.
Yeah.
And I think part of this, the relativity involved and the degree to which those principles, or the degree to which you apply those principles, is almost entirely arbitrary, is someone who traces that through line pretty directly is a guy by the name of D.C. Schindler. And he's written and spoken a lot about what he would call the politics of the real, which is the intrinsic political orientation of the Christian faith, which is a lot of times people accept the notion that Christianity is apolitical. But if you look at the attitudes of a lot of thought leaders before the Reformation and then well after in the Catholic Church, is that it's quite the opposite. And something you might hear often is the idea that the church is who teaches nations how to be a nation. The church doesn't do the governing, the church doesn't do necessarily the installing of this or that leader, but the church's concern is with the degree to which the people know how to be a just and righteous people. Which means if I try to convey justice and mercy and righteousness and fairness on an individualized basis that is not inherently connected to my standard for learning righteousness and truth and justice and all those things, then the arbitrary nature of the authority I look to will become the arbitrary nature of my expression of faith and justice and all those things. And one of the ways that Schindler describes it is what liberalism seeks to do is to separate goodness from order. So, and that's where you see the assumption you hear a lot and can see a lot behaviorally in Protestantism, that goodness is an extrinsic factor that I introduce into order and just hope that that goodness is enough to overcome the inherent flaws of order. And it takes order and makes it this secular thing, takes goodness and makes it this esoteric, disembodied thing, and then seeks to affirm both separately. The problem is, the goodness of the gospel is not esoteric and disembodied.
Yeah.
And the order of the gospel is real and present and clear in the teaching that the church has held to for most of history.
Yeah.
So I deprive both of those principles of the thing that makes them applicable and useful. So now any engagement I have with justice or with goodness or truth or beauty or whatever, it's up to me to figure out how to give it flesh. Mm-hmm. And any engagement I have with order is morally gray.
Yeah.
And that often leads to attempts at order that are robbed of goodness because there's no clearly defined way to bring goodness to bear. And any experience of goodness I have is unique to me individually. So the only real authority there can be on my engagement with goodness is me. And this makes the standard, there can't be a coherent standard from this case to this case for goodness or the expression of it. Because all I can appeal to is my subjective experience of apparent goodness, which is most of the time different than their subjective experience of goodness. Because neither one of us has ever been given an example of a clear, physical, visible expression of any positive moral good. And this is kind of it's a dialed in example of something that I think is overall the case with Protestantism because of the assumptions that liberal makes, which is effectively Gnostic, which is the material world and the physical world, the visible world, is broken inherently and there's no hope for it. Mm-hmm. So everything good, true, and beautiful is going to be invisible.
Yeah.
That is not the gospel by any means. You can't read the gospel on its own terms and come away with that assumption.
Right.
The assumption of the gospel is, Jesus can't redeem what he hasn't assumed.
Right. Well, that's why they thought that Jesus didn't come in a human body.
Exactly.
They didn't think humans had any redeeming qualities.
But the general Christian thought is quite the opposite. He can only redeem what he assumes, therefore what he assumes is on purpose. Mm-hmm. And he chooses to assume a physical body. Mm-hmm. And this is also missed with a lot of the visible church versus the invisible church, where Protestants are willing to say, no, the little c Catholic Church, that's who I'm with, but there's no visible expression. It's all symbolic, basically, which means there's actually no hope. The suffering and whatever that I encounter in the visible world just has to get chalked up he works all things for good. But that good is not physical.
Yeah.
So whatever good I experience for physical suffering doesn't actually do anything about the suffering. The best I get is subjective consolation that, I have treasure in heaven. But even that presumption is okay, what's heaven? It's somewhere in the clouds that you're going to go disembodied and float around? Or what's much more evident in Scripture, it's coming here. And you're going to live physically here in a New Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Those lend themselves to very different relationships with the world. And this is why someone like Schindler says, at all points in Christian history, the role of the church has been to protect the real. Because he describes liberalism as a religion without things. Because the sort of foundation of a thing is that it's a communal concept. I know things ideally, I encounter everything as a potential meeting place where I know this thing and you know this thing. And at this thing that we have both apprehended, we have come together. Mm-hmm. Liberalism can't make the movement from a unifying human existential experience to a physical thing. And so I end up practicing this religion absent of things. So the only unifying property, even remotely possible, is a esoteric, we at least try to communicate our subjective experience, but only to the degree that we have both had a subjective experience. I can never know what you experienced, and you can never know what I experienced, because there's nothing concrete there. Mm-hmm. And this lends itself to Protestant, but also I think even the strictly spiritual presence. I know more and more Protestants who would call them, they would say they believe in real presence, but it's a mystery. And it's like, yeah, there's a lot that's mysterious that we don't get to know. The presence of Jesus physically, we got to know that. Like, he did that.
Yeah.
So we don't have to disregard something that Jesus initiated, that we have a context for, just because we don't like the idea of trying to explain something away. There's a difference between explaining something away to justify your position versus explaining something away to, like, it puts the person in a position to explain something away is the fact that Jesus did something very evident, and you have to make an argument for why it's not evident. Because if you grant any ground to this idea of the continuation of the incarnation, I put into jeopardy every other theological point I could make to justify my position.
Right.
And so, Schindler says something where he says, the category of Christian social teaching is the politics of the real. He says the church is the protector of the real and truth. When the authority is stripped, or when that authority is stripped, we are left with a religion without things, and there's nowhere for us to meet.
Right.
And even like my engagement with everyone is aesthetic. I'm engaging with whether or not they display this or that esoteric position. But because there's not a concrete standard for the position of the experience, it's up to me to judge whether or not they've had it based on what they display. And a few days ago, I had a friend say that he could not come to terms with the idea that Protestant churches don't have the Eucharist, along the lines of like, I just can't believe it. Like I've done it myself. I know the people who believe in it. Like, it's too genuine for me to not believe that this is the case, for me to deprive them of this. And part of my response was like, if it's sincerity of display that assures you of someone else's being saved, you're going to freak out when you hear about the Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses or whoever. I know way more really uncontroversial, well-behaved Mormons than I know uncontroversial, well-behaved Christians.
Well, and Mormons blow like Protestants and Catholics out of the water when it comes to church attendance.
Oh, absolutely. But that's not because, like, according to the standard of someone displaying that experience, we can't compete, or at least we don't.
Yeah, right.
But I can still confidently say, theologically, you're wrong. You can be the nicest guy in the world. And according to a subjective, arbitrary standard, you're Jesus' strongest soldier. But because of what you believe and what you affirm to be true, because it can be demonstrated to not be true, I have to relinquish my judgment of your character to the standard. Or even, not even character, because you can admire someone's character and fully acknowledge them not be saved.
Yeah.
But for me I can't make a statement about me being unified with you just based off of you're a nice guy.
Right.
Because that's arbitrary. What if one day you're mean? What if
you're not saved?
What if I meet a nice guy who does not like me? Am I unified with him?
Yeah.
That's completely preferential.
Yeah.
And part of the the foundation of something like liberalism is the consent of the governed. And so the authority, this is also why it takes such a grip and changes Europe politically so much, is because coupled with this idea of the importance of my subjective understanding, I also have, I don't recognize any authority over me that goes against my consent. And so it treats leaders, this in my opinion goes back to what we talked about last time about the lack of concrete resilience of authority that evangelicalism would offer leaders, is because every single person in that position views themselves not as devoting their life to upholding the standard. They devote their life to winning the consent of those that they want to lead and winning the consent of as many people as possible, which turns your entire career into a campaign. And it strips your own authority of its substance, because it's just, there is no, this is why, and obviously not there's many exceptions to any case you would offer, but generally your average priest is a lot more comfortable correcting, disagreeing, putting his foot down on this or that issue, because his authority is not rooted in the degree to which the listener likes him.
Yeah.
It's rooted in the degree to which he is devoting his life and time to sacramental ministry. And it also, because there's a clear definition of what a Catholic is and what the Catholic Church is, you have every right and every inclination to go, either you're in or you're out. If you're out, that's fine. But if you're in, you're in.
You're right.
And you see the opposite of this in a lot of Calvinist circles, where no one can decide what Calvinism is and what Calvinism isn't. And then you'll have someone say, I'm a Calvinist, and then you'll explain to them John Calvin's philosophy, and they'll go, oh, that's not Calvinism.
Yeah.
Or with the Anglican Church, where for the past 100 years, no one can tell what Anglicanism is and what it isn't. To the extent
Especially
that
now.
it is so easy to find an Anglican who would say that the Episcopal Church is heretical. And then you go on their website and it's the Episcopal Anglican Church. And there's no one to correct them. And that is because there is not a standard. There's no things.
Yeah.
And I think this is so specifically addressed in transubstantiation and the Eucharist. And it's like, the thing that unites me is a thing. It's something I can see. It's something so real I can ingest it, and it can inhabit my body, because that is the function that God intends to reveal himself through the world in. There is no demiurge that created the material world in spite of a good God who knows that material is evil. This is God who created every version there is of matter and of the physical world, and every single time said, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good. So if I can acknowledge that what I read in Genesis affects the whole earth, and then I can acknowledge that everything that happened in Genesis gets corrected in Christ, then there is now hope for the physical world. And the unity that I can have is not preferential or anything like that, but there is a real substance that then gets expounded upon to make sense of every level, whether it's the political level, the economic level, or the spiritual level. I can take them all. I don't have to parse out and figure out what I believe on every single case. I have a concrete standard that all of them can be placed into the context of, and I see Christ there. Because I see the physical world being inhabited by an alternative that I would never have articulated on my own. And I think it's very easy to hear an explanation like that feels almost too good to be true in some cases, in how top down it satisfies the whole picture. But I would be willing to bet that pretty much every distinctly Protestant position, you could demonstrate its failure in its lack of genuine embodied thought. And there's this resentment towards the body. There's this resentment towards visible authority. And I think about when G.K. Chesterton, in his book about Thomas Aquinas, he compares Aquinas to the Crusaders, where he says the Crusaders went and took the Holy Land because they believed that it belonged to Christ. And for better or for worse, they successfully retook it on that conviction. And it is in the same way, when someone like Martin Luther criticizes Aquinas for studying Aristotle, and basically saying it's useless, we don't need that, Chesterton says, in the same way that the Crusaders did, Aquinas reclaimed the body, reclaimed the physical world through his philosophy because he believed that it belonged to Christ. And even though you can make whatever reference you want to, oh, well, I'm filled with the Spirit, all this stuff, the veil is gone, blah, 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 blah. It's yeah, that's great, that's awesome. But if the Spirit only brings you to the spiritual realm and can't actually be, the whole point of the incarnation is about the invisible God being made visible by material means. And so even though there's a degree to which the Holy Spirit illuminates someone's heart and brings wisdom and understanding, he does so for the sake of the world. He does so because of the things that belong to him, which is by whatever manner you think the Holy Spirit gives you wisdom, I promise you, It is best applied by your action to bring that reality to bear in the world. And the Lord could have chosen at any time to sort of sequester himself in the ideal realm, but he doesn't do that. He takes arguably, like the most of the things that we appeal to as like ideals about God, moral exemplars, there is obviously a degree to which they exist away from the material world. And even though like Aquinas, someone like Aquinas, and the church in general is illuminated by this, they take the, by some standards, lower road of the physical in order to demonstrate that it too belongs to this knowledge that they have in Christ. Because the mind of Christ is always for the world. It's never for, Christ never makes any, he never offers any sort of imperative to his disciples that call them out of the world. It's always for the purpose of sending them in, walking the road that seems lower in order to demonstrate that it belongs to Christ. Or that at least it contains things that belongs to Christ, like the body and the people at every scale.
Right.
And so I think some of this stuff is so broad that it feels like it's easy to hear explanations about that sort of stuff and be like, okay, what are we doing? Like, I just go to church on Sunday. And it's like, yes, that's true. And I completely understand the exhaustion that some people may have with things they might consider too philosophical. But, spoiler alert, philosophy belongs to Christ. It's all his. And so if I'm not willing to concede that I am here for the world, I was created for the world and the world were for me. I'm not being rescued from the world. Right. I'm preparing the world for his arrival. And if I relinquish that, or if I give my thoughts over to anything that moved me to relinquish that, if I can never conceive of the communion being Christ, that will affect how I behave in the world. If I conceive of authority structure as being inherently secular, which is a distinctly liberal assumption, then I will concede ground to the secular world and to things that are not of Christ, when in reality, they belong to him.
Right.
And I end up letting anti-Christ ideologies play with the tools that belong to Jesus. And I'll watch them break the tools because they don't know how to use them.
Right.
And it's I feel like pretty much everyone you would talk to would be willing to acknowledge a dissatisfaction with structure and authority as they see it in the world. But it's because the world, specifically in the West, everyone has come to be in a world where those things are already conceded to an ideology that is specifically contradictory to the ideology they claim to adhere to in the gospel.
Well, yeah, and I think that's going back to what you just said and then a little bit further, I think it's an evangelical principle where we're so focused on the next life that we forget that we are given things for now. Like we're not just preparing for heaven. Like it's like all the signs are like, you're going to hell, prepare yourself to not go to hell.
Yeah.
And it's just all focused on the next life and nothing right now. And we see that even like Catholics and Protestants alike, they don't vote like they should. Like they don't participate in the system because we have this idea that this world is separate from our world now and that we don't really have to care about it because we have the ultimate next.
Right.
That's really not the case. I mean, that's a horrible way to look at it because there's, like you said, God became incarnate and became a person on earth, wanted to be seen, and we're just losing the material for the next life. I want to go into unity because you talked a little bit about it, but there can be no unity in liberalism besides the fact that they're unified in their objection to objective truth.
Right.
Like they can't be unified anywhere because everybody's able to believe whatever. Like in liberalism, one can believe in God, one can't believe in God, and they have to be okay with that.
Right.
There's so many avenues that it denies one of Jesus's core principles, which is unity.
Right.
Because they can't unify in anything. John 17:22 says, I have given them the glory that you have given me, that they may be one as we are one, I in them and you in me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. then the world will know that you sent me and that you have loved them even as you've loved me. Liberalism doesn't allow for unity.
Yeah.
It allows for the subjective opinions to flow in from every corner, and you have to accept it.
Yeah.
Because it's everybody's subjective, you know, it's their life and they believe what they believe, and you know, you can't be too hard-headed, and you can't, you know, disagree, because it's just subjective. Everything's subjective. But it's like, if that's what people fail to realize when they go down these routes, like, I have my practices and they have their practices, and like,
right.
it's good. Like, as long as I can stay on my side, they can stay on their side. It's like, that's not the case. Like John 14:6, I read it when we came out. It's like, you can't do that.
Right.
Like, it begins to fall apart. Like, it's good if you don't want any controversy, but it's like, you have to live in some sort of controversy if you subscribe to the unity of the gospel and the one way to heaven. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I just think that is a terrible, terrible thing that we let in, that we don't see the full scope of unity just disintegrating by letting liberalism seep in to the church and our ideals. I also want to do toleration, because I kind of got into it. This is another one of the core principles from the Enlightenment. Promotes pluralism and the free exchange of ideas, opposing uncritical adherence to religious or state dogmas. It's not necessarily like a religious freedom. One has the ability to exercise religious freedom, but the danger is like a non-sectarianism. It's basically a fallacy presented as fundamental truth that one religion is as good as the other. Like, I'll do mine and they do theirs. It's basically kind of what people have no idea, that the Mormons aren't Trinitarian, the Jehovah's Witness. Like, oh, but they have Jesus on the sign. You know, like that is liberalism in and of itself.
Right.
They have Jesus, I have Jesus. It's not the same one, but, you know, look,
we're all friends here.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone has, therefore, the right to believe as one pleases, and differences in creed are just that of expression or subjective.
Right.
And it's like Enlightenment idea seeping into the church once again.
Oh, absolutely. And it's talking about modernity. Rocco Buglione, who wrote a book called Modernity's Alternative, he goes through a great deal to describe, obviously, what happens in Europe that leads to modernity, specifically the discovery of the New World. Like, that's what he would, like 1492, modernity steps onto the scene. And the challenge being, the reason it is such like a catalyst is because you're entering a time philosophically where it's becoming more and more prevalent to believe that European culture at the time had sort of comprehended the world and had asserted itself as the ultimate advancement of human culture, and you kind of exhaust the grounds for like ingenuity or creativity in any certain direction, because European culture was so dominant,
right,
and in many ways so far ahead of most of the world that there wasn't much left to do. And this is where you get this sentiment, like Soren Kierkegaard talks about in relationship to Hegel, where he opens one of his books and says, it's been the standard for a long time that all there is to do for any philosopher is to lay another brick on the wall. And here's like, I have no intention of doing that, which is a sentiment like that, when that's being written in the 1800s, can really only come from someone as cynical as someone like Kierkegaard, because even by the time Kierkegaard's writing that, you have Martin Luther, John Wycliffe, John Calvin, all these guys, John Knox, all reinforcing and taking a step further this view that then gets culturally latched onto, where you have entire nations becoming Protestant by the identity of their rulers. And then in the philosophical realm, you have people like Spinoza and Kant and ultimately Hegel, who reinforce this idea of like, this is it. We exhausted it. And then right smack dab in the middle of that, you have this revelation that the culture that thought it had comprehended the world now had to do something with an entire hemisphere it did not comprehend. And something that Buglione talks about is you're left with two options, where the safety of the boundaries you seem to have exhausted in your understanding of them is now broken. And there's entire cultures across the ocean that you have to do something with. And consider it based on the image you have of what a human is and what people are, what a people is, you have to make one movement. Either I have to look at a culture that is objectively less developed than me, and I have to humble my conception of what humanity is in order to make room for them, and from that position evangelize them. Or I have to maintain my standard for what a human is and what a people is, and I have to degrade this oppositional culture and subject them to my standard. And what emerges in that is these varying approaches to what to do with the realm of possibility. And you end up getting three real players in that cultural competition. You have Catholic modernity, where really the best cultural expression of Catholic modernity is in the Baroque movement, which mainly takes root in places like Italy and Spain and Portugal, and then by way of colonization, South America. And the real foundation to the Baroque is the safety you have to tolerate distinction in light of the greater unity. And two of the most apparent examples of this is someone like Caravaggio, where you look at a Caravaggio painting and it is almost disorienting how real and detailed it was, to the extent that you could get lost in any corner of the painting with a detail present. But in that same initial encounter that disorients you, you also are immediately aware of what's going on.
Right.
And if you need an example, the cover of our last video was a Caravaggio painting of Thomas touching the wound in Jesus' side. You could zoom in on any 6 square inches of that painting and look at it all day long. And it is in that distinction and in the initial visceral presentation of the whole that I come to experience two dynamics of what is essentially true at the same time. And then when you look at a Baroque cathedral, most of your Gothic, Romanesque cathedrals and stuff like that, you would walk in and there's a long walk up, and then at the back of the room, you have the altar with the Eucharist, and maybe like one chapel off to the side. Baroque cathedrals are where you would often find 4 walkways from either direction and the altar in the middle, and then 4 or 5 chapels here off to the side, such that I can stand somewhere in the cathedral where every other part of, and also massive spires in the center. So when you're standing at the altar, you're only really apprehending 20% of the space. But it's in the complexity of the space that they all converge on a moment. So I can stand comfortably in this or that corner and still be participating in the movement towards the whole, because the whole has accounted for every space, such that like there's not a moment where I'm out of view. There's not a moment where I'm not occupying the whole, despite the fact that I am not privy to the whole necessarily. And it's the way Buglione describes it is the complexity of space with the safety of the unity of the space. And that's an image of what Catholic modernity is we have these cultures to which we have never been privy, and to which when we are there, we are essentially isolated and cut off from everything we know. But because I am a human and that is a human, and we both bear the image, and I know, like Catholic thinkers in this area will talk about the covenant that God makes with Noah, which is creation will never revolt against being like that. And there are essential truths like it is better to be than to not be. Justice is better than tyranny. All that pain or goodness is better than pain and suffering and all these things. You don't have to know the details of a Christian worldview to know those foundational things. So when Catholics when priests are in the New World encountering these groups, some people criticize it for syncretism, but the Catholic ministry philosophy in this respect involves, I venture down into what seems to be lesser than where I'm operating from. But in doing so, I liberate those bound to the lesser by demonstrating what belongs to Christ and pruning the rest. And one of the best examples of this is in Europe, but and a good bit before, but I think it's a good example of the conversion of the Albigensians with the Rosary.
Yeah.
And it's like they had been trying the method for a long time of just pushing this pagan culture out. And then with the introduction of the Rosary, what takes place is what Catholics would refer to as the people evangelizing themselves. Because I introduce the fullness form of truth, and they're able to recognize this fits. This thing that we've been doing for thousands of years fits right in. This thing we've been doing also for 1,000 years doesn't fit in. So we can keep this and get rid of this. Now, that people has a faith as a people, such that like it's not relative to like how Catholic that guy is and how Catholic that guy is. The people themselves have been evangelized by the ultimate truth of the gospel, such that you look now and there are unique Catholic identities varying by people, and they're all comfortably unified in their complexity. Whereas anything that is esoteric and sort of disembodied can't handle complexity, because I can't hold in my mind that many distinctions without seeing it. And which also leads to cognitive dissonance, where if I introduce enough distinctions and I feel a pressure to hold all of them, I can only hold one at a time, to where I can say one thing and then also believe and practice its opposite or something completely incommensurable with it. And I have to, because I don't have any other option. And you see the same thing with Our Lady of Guadalupe and what happens there, where basically the church is having a very hard time converting these South American and Central American indigenous people. And when this apparition of Mary occurs, one, she's very clear about who she is and that she is the mother of Christ and all that stuff. She's talking to a indigenous man saying, I want a chapel right here, very practically in a way that having a chapel right there or a church right there made it easier for other indigenous people to go to church. But a key aspect of the apparition is she doesn't present herself like a European or like a Palestinian or whatever. She presents herself in the appearance of a mestizo woman, where now I have the mother of Christ showing up in this land that is very divided as the synthesis of the cultures that are divided.
Right.
And after that miracle, the church gets built and indigenous people start converting en masse. And so now the places where you see the Baroque carried on in South America are places where their becoming Christian was dependent. Oh, another key detail is a lot of Latin American cultural myths contained this like mother goddess identity.
Yeah.
The difference was in those religions, she was not a virgin. She didn't even have a physical body, and the picture she painted of femininity and motherhood was a lot more secular. It had very little to do with faithfulness and tenderness and all that stuff.
Right.
And every indigenous person would have recognized those qualities, especially because part of the way that that like Mary shows herself in that apparition, the clothing and some of the like colors and stuff associated with it are referential to that mother goddess. And so she's able to meet these people on their own terms, weed out what does not belong to Christ, affirm what does. And that's kind of where you see, like that moment is kind of where you see a solidifying of the mestiza ideal, which is these two cultures in dialogue with one another for the sake of demonstrating the truth that's present in both.
Right.
And that's why, probably more so than any other culture, there is a distinct Latin American Catholicism.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that the church concedes ground to a culture that's contradictory. The church reclaims what about that culture, because there will be something.
Yeah.
That's God's covenant with Noah. There will be things naturally evident to you that lend themselves to ultimate truth. But it's the job of the church to go in and shepherd the people in becoming a Christian. And that is so unbelievably dependent on the visible movement of the gospel into a culture. And that spatial complexity, where as a Catholic, I can look at the world and entertain the complexity and the distinct beauty of each expression, of everywhere that the church has taught those people to be a nation. Poland's also a really good example. And to the point that as all these events are going on in South America, you have bishops looking at Poland as an example of like, okay, if they can do it here, we can do it.
Yeah.
If they can do it there, we can do it here. And that is a very involved, very exhaustive philosophy for evangelism. The problem is, it requires that I entertain equally extreme degrees of complexity and unity. But it's like Pope Francis really doubles down on this idea of unity is always more important. Mm-hmm. It's always more authoritative than distinction. Right. That's why distinction can exist, because the unity with which I'm engaging that distinction and contextualizing that distinction is the ultimate truth involved. And so my engagement with distinction is merely, I step into this space comfortably with the unity, and I now make it clear what parts of that unity, what distinguishing properties actually are maintained within the unity. And it is just the job of the church and church teaching and the shepherding of bishops and deacons and all that stuff that comes in and facilitates the culture evangelizing itself. And part of the reason that the Protestant mind and the Protestant project can't run on those same terms is because, one, like you're saying, this idea of the subjectivity of the intellectual life. When liberalism, and specifically liberalism, is willing to make the move, and the Enlightenment are willing to make the move that the truest things are invisible and individual, then, and that movement of separating goodness from order, it is now my responsibility personally to somehow reconcile these categories. And it is entirely, I don't have any unity to be comfortable in.
Right.
And I am, as soon as I'm conscious, I'm under this very intense pressure to figure it out for myself and to find something valuable. And that's part of the response with Protestant modernity and secular modernity. The move that they make against Catholic modernity is, even though ideally, and you would think, Catholic modernity and Protestant modernity find more in common with the gospel than they do out of common with cultural and institutional expression, what you see is Protestantism is willing to concede the ground to secular modernity that the religious life and the spiritual life are better restrained personally, and that there's no valid reason for the religious life to be expressed outwardly. Right. So you see the coherent movement, specifically that movement of individualizing and estranging the practitioner from any visible expression of the practice, especially at a communal level. Catholic modernity is overwhelmed. And that's not to say like, oh, Catholics were doing everything right and we just got ganged up on. There is a very significant degree to which liberalism was taking effect on the Catholic Church. And in many ways, more so than being overwhelmed, the ideological weight of Catholic modernity was withdrawn. And Buglione talks about this, like basically the Catholic Church gets misdirected into a counter-reformation. So rather than asserting the pre-existent truth in their way of doing things, they become a reaction to the Reformation. The problem is the terms of the Reformation are terms contrary to Catholic thought and Catholic social teaching. So you end up playing a game built for you to lose.
Yeah.
Because you are tricked into reaction, because everyone is so uncomfortable with these developing cultural myths that people are picking their side on. So then and you also have a pretty clear divide of like South America as this an expression of Catholic modernity and the interplay between South America and Europe, contrasted to the interplay between Europe and North America, where the North American Christian communities were largely Puritan. Even looking at the 13 colonies, they're not even united on what denomination they are. And there's already beef, because the Puritans don't like whoever. And the Puritans hated the Anglicans, and they were neighbors. And so the foundation of this country is dependent on the philosophical assumption that all the present ideas are of equal value, and that the independence and the unique identity of this nation is one of, I will not be governed against my consent. So that sets the ball rolling for the future, that all you need to break down any sense of unity you might have is to double down on what that sense of unity is. The only thing I have in common with my neighbor is that we are both obligated to pursue our material gain.
Yeah.
So even the thing that I might shake hands with him on about, I am also incentivized to stab him in the back immediately after if he's threatening my well-being or my material well-being specifically. The problem is the people that find themselves in positions of power and influence in the 13 colonies were not Christian.
No.
They were mostly deists.
Yeah.
And so not only were they willing to concede that any personal interaction with God should be reserved for the private life, the deists were willing to concede that there is no personal interaction with God. So this thing that Protestantism kind of snuck under the table with the relativism of how your religion is expressed becomes a thing that eats it alive. Because once you're willing to concede the outward-facing, big picture dependence on objective truth, it's going to you can't give it an inch.
Right.
Once you think you've given it an inch, it has already taken a mile.
Just takes it.
And so even after Catholic modernity has stepped back, and there's still some sense of like a culturally Christian environment, it does not take long for the ground that's already been conceded to secular modernity to overrun it.
Yeah.
So now there's no Protestant modernity or Catholic modernity. Modernity as a whole is most authoritatively narrated by secularism, which is fundamentally anti-Christian.
Yeah.
And I think this is also part of the reason, even more so, not to pretend like the Catholic Church is like figured everything out, but I think it's not crazy to come into contact with younger militant Catholics who still treat their identity as a Catholic as if it is a relative identity, the legitimacy of which is based on my ability to appear as someone on the team. And it's the same level of insecurity, because rather than submitting to this unifying myth, I sit there and I take what I want and disregard what I don't. And rather than submitting to the church, I've made an aesthetic out of the church that I then display so that people can have better reason to believe that I play on the team that I play for. And I try to manufacture the safety of my identity using the thing that if I would just go all the way in, would provide that.
Yeah.
But I've never been taught how to go all the way in. And I think this also lends itself in a more postmodern context, which effectively the victory that secular modernity has over Protestantism is the inception of postmodernity, where I've accepted the position that I will arrive at truth based on my preference and my subjective experience. Then, after, like that is the movement that Protestantism thinks it makes in asserting its individuality and the lack of concrete authority. The movement that is making it at the same time that doesn't recognize is, I make that movement in agreement with the thought system that tells me there is no such thing as the good thing. There's no matter what I pick, it's the same.
Yeah.
So now, rather than the modern project being like, how do I convince everyone? Like, I choose what's good for me, and then I debate everyone, or I then wage war on the things that I've determined are not good. What happens after that, and there's still a degree of confidence in like, no, if I like it, it's good. If it compels me, it's good. And there's a degree of safety that's like, even though my choice is hyper-individualistic and I don't have any concrete expression of community, I'm right. What happens after the fact, if I really apply the thing I've accepted, is I realize, well, actually, there's no reason to believe that what I believe is good. There's no reason to believe that what I have latched onto is any more authoritative than what anyone else has latched onto. And I think that is the perfect world for generative AI to be born into, because I'm so overwhelmed by the pressure of figuring anything else out by myself, and the sort of like the Sisyphean task of figuring out how I'm going to get this rock up the hill. And then it falls back down, and I go, wait, everyone's rock is falling back down. Like, I'm having just as hard of a time pushing my rock as he is pushing his. Why would I pick anything?
Yeah.
So then my two options are resign into the absurdity of what my life has become in terms of finding out what's valuable or not, or resign from the task. It's either indifference or delusion. And now we offer this tool culture that goes, hey, you ask it anything, and it'll tell you.
Yeah.
You ask it, like, you need to figure something out, even to the extent that you can present it a genuine delusion, and it will cheer you on the whole way.
Yep.
There's not, a YouTuber named Eddie Burback has like a 3-hour-long video where he tells AI that he's received a vision from a dream that he was the smartest baby in the world, and ChatGPT leads him on a weeks-long pilgrimage to reclaim the intelligence he had when he was a baby.
Yeah.
And every step of the way, he's telling people he's being followed, like all this stuff that is like, any person would hear that and be like, what are you doing? You need to be put in an asylum. And ChatGPT, in that stupid HR voice, is like, you are so valid for feeling that way.
Yeah.
And it's like, that is the pacifier in the mouth of someone who doesn't know how to process the fact that their actions have consequences.
Right.
And that what they do with this moment is what they do with everything. And that unfortunately, the kind of person you are becomes the kind of person you are. You know what I'm saying? And it's frustrating, because that's part of what I mean when I say Protestantism can't articulate itself in the face of all this. Because the assumptions that got us here are present intrinsically to Protestantism. So if I relinquish the assumptions I made to be a Protestant, I have to cease being a Protestant.
Right.
Which is not, that's the most, if I'm dependent on my judgment of identity and I know that all the consequences come back on me, the thought of completely making a visceral shift in how I discern what my identity is, I have everything to lose. That's the genuine leap of faith. It's like, I can sit here and work through every possibility, but I will never make a decision because that's too risky.
Too risky, yeah. So what's the result of all this? I looked up a study before we came, and it said, from the first year we have reliable data, the conservative-leaning Anglican Church, which it's changed a little bit, of North America in 2013 showed that Sunday attendance was about 64,000. And the Episcopal Church at this time had an attendance of 624,000.
Across the country?
North America.
That's crazy.
So at that point, and over a decade ago, the more conservative splinter group was about 1/10 of the size of the main church. By 2020, the Anglican Church of North America Sunday attendance had risen to 71,000. which isn't explosive growth, but it is still in the positive territory. By contrast, in 2022, the Episcopals' attendance was 349,000, having cratered by nearly half during this time. Consequently, in the span of about a decade, the North American Anglican Church went from 10% to 20% of that size of the Episcopal Church. And the cited reasons for the decline in this is the liberal theology, clergy watering down what the scriptures actually say, discounting belief in the supernatural in order to make their religious message more palatable for modern audiences. We see that with non-denominational too. And finds that it's actually conservative theology with its emphasis on the factual truth of Scripture and God's activity in the world that fuels church growth. It appears that the move away from the Bible has led to shrinking attendance at mainline Protestant churches in Western societies. And then Harvard did a study about Gen Z, and it says, evidence suggests Gen Z is showing increased interest in affiliation with Catholicism, with a notable rise in identification from 15% in 2022 to 21% in 2023. According to the Harvard study, driven by a search for meaning, truth, community, and a structure in a complex world, especially among young men seeking purpose and tradition. This trend isn't just in the US, but is seen across the West, with some areas like the UK showing young Catholics outnumbering Anglicans. The search for truth, and it just goes back to liberalism being the affirmation of the absolute independence of the individual and social reasons. So you have to submit to the independence of the individual, while Catholicism is the dogma of absolute subjection of the individual social order to the revelation of God. And it's like, we have a little bit different reasons why we came to Catholicism as the truth, but that's what it was for me. It's like, I see this liberal theology infiltrating, and we're losing ground on things like divorce and contraceptives and women being priests and all these ideas of, is Scripture really inerrant or is it errant? And, what do we believe in Scripture? What's literal? And it's like everybody is able to have a different idea. And it's like people want somebody to tell them or have somebody to subscribe. And not everybody have differing opinions, but act like they're unified.
Right.
Like we just have to avoid everything, like even Jesus being triune, or the triune nature of God. It's like, okay, we have to pretend for the sake of our own unity, which we're not having unity at all, to remain, like we aren't closed-minded.
Right.
And it's like people are leaving. The Episcopal Church losing 300,000 in 8 years in North America, which that's not surprising. We see the reels of drag queens coming in and preaching, and rainbow sashes and
Sparkle Creed.
The Sparkle Creed. It's like no one actually who wants to watch that? Seriously. If you're like a faithful Episcopal and you're like trying your best to be Catholic but not be Catholic, and you walk in and they're doing the Sparkle Creed, you're like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
It's like, no wonder. And that is the literal effects of liberalism as we see it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a very practical and then also a much more like broad thing that brings to mind. The practical one is my friend that I mentioned earlier who just like couldn't stomach saying that Protestants, whatever. And he said something about like he cares too much about unity. And I was like, really? And in fact, one of our other friends who's not even Catholic, he made the comment, he was like, what are you talking about? You can't be Catholic because you care too much about unity. He's like, if unity is your thing, every other environment is a losing game. Yeah. And part of one of the things I said was just saying like Protestantism is antithetical to unity. And they both responded and were like, oh, I wouldn't say it's antithetical, because like you can have a Presbyterian and this or that, and they'll all pray with each other. Mm-hmm. So that's unity. And I was like, since when is that the standard for unity? Mm-hmm. First of all, you won't find every Protestant praying with each other, because there's groups of Lutherans and Presbyterians who won't pray with anyone unless you're Lutheran or Presbyterian. Right. More so the Lutherans, just because they base it on creeds. But there are other Lutherans who don't handle the creeds the same way they do. So there are Lutherans who won't pray for Lutherans. So that's a pretty weird standard. I'll pray for a Muslim any day of the week. I'll pray for a Mormon any day of the week. I'm not unified with them.
Yeah.
And if the standard of who I'll pray with and who I won't, find me in Scripture where that standard is offered. Give me concrete, like, church teaching before 1500 where that was the standard for who was in and who was not. There isn't one. That is completely preferential.
Right.
And second of all, it's very, very interesting to say that the people doing the best job of unity are the ones that literally cannot stop schisming with one each other. I was talking to some friends of mine recently who were Anglican, and one of them was sort of describing the first conversation we had. There was a big group of us sitting at a table, and one of them looked at me and said, like, mouthed the words, "Are you becoming Catholic?" And I was like, yeah. And as soon as it was over, they came over and started talking to me. And it was a couple that I was talking to. And they were lamenting all the schisms that the Anglican Church has seen over the years. And one of them was even saying, like, reiterating a couple times, like, it feels like it's so much better than what we used to have because we grew up in the same megachurch. She's like, it's obviously so much better than that, but I still feel like there's something missing. And I was like, well, and went on this long rant about all these things the church is schismed over and complaining about the Episcopal Church and and complaining, basically acknowledging, like, Anglicanism in terms of global unity is effectively a African religion now. It hardly has anything to do with London or Canterbury or the King or whatever. Which is crazy because it's still technically the case that the King of England is the head of the Anglican Church.
Yeah.
How do you even get there?
Yeah, right.
And one of the things she was asking, like, not directly to me, just kind of thinking out loud, being like, why is that the case? How do you stop that? And kind of in tongue in cheek, I said, well, the trick into not schisming is to not schism. Like, just don't do that.
Simple as that.
It's literally as simple as these guys that we all started as a part of, just stop protesting. And it's like, that's part of the reason I don't think the title and the essence of Protestantism has any hope for, and I'm more and more convinced that to change what needs to be changed in Protestantism, to get rid of some of these issues that even Protestants recognize, they get right up to the point of go down to the roots and get rid of what is causing you to do this. If you can identify the rot, cut it out.
Yeah.
The problem is
you can't.
It stops being Protestantism.
That's too close-minded. You
stops being Protestantism.
Can't cut that out.
Even while we were preparing for this, one of the first things I wrote down was the more I look into it and the more I read and talk to people on stuff, I am less and less convinced of hope for Protestantism.
Yeah.
Until you get rid of the protest. So, like, step number one, stop protesting.
Yeah.
Okay, now you're not Protestant anymore.
Yeah, right.
So you're more than free to actually take hold of this.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, we were kind of talking about this earlier, and I think this is relevant considering the wave of conversions that we are very much part of. I mean, our diocese right now is the fastest growing in the country.
Amen.
But the method that I was describing earlier, of allowing a people to evangelize themselves, often loosely, if not directly, associated with what would be called the theology of the peoples, which Pope Francis was, like, on the forefront of. A guy like Rocco Buglione has been very much in the ear of three popes now in regards to this. The problem is the United States is in a very unique position because, and I think you could throw Canada in there too, and I think increasingly so you could throw England in there too, of the problem of walking the path of a people and reclaiming their social myth requires a people to have a coherent social myth, of which more and more post-Christian environments don't have.
No.
And just as much as having more conversations around this stuff makes me confident of the truth that's there, I've also run into a lot of Catholic converts from the last 2 years to now in our age range where they are using the identity as Catholic it's more so a weapon in an arsenal that is more concerned with fighting a culture war than it is with making the earth look like heaven. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know exactly what that looks like, but part of the issue, just the issue with doing that is you end up not being Catholic.
Yeah.
It's just as much like when you read Charles Taylor's social critique, something that comes up is like picket fence identity, which is I have my fence and I have each individual plank, and when one plank breaks or something goes wrong, I just replace it with one.
Yeah.
Whereas my being Catholic is a plank, but I also have my being conservative, my being a young white man, or whatever, or even stuff as simple as like I can't get a girlfriend, so here's this new thing that I support with this, and you end up having a lot of conversations with people. I had a conversation with a guy the other day who claimed to be Catholic, and some listeners might be on board with this. I'm not. Basically saying that interracial relationships were a sin. And he's being presented over and over again by other Catholics with evidence that that is directly contradictory to dogmatic church teaching. Mm-hmm. And it's just not coming through to him. And it's like, the environment that this place was happening, it was specifically oriented towards young Catholics. And it's like, you are raging against the thing you supposed to have submitted to for the preservation of this one niche political view that you hold to. Mm-hmm. What is and you can't, there's nothing anyone could say to you that would change your opinion right now.
No.
Because you have all the niche, random facts, whatever you think you need, and then the one thing against which those would be checked, you've already decided you know more, or you know better. And so, prior to even evangelizing non-Catholics, I think especially in the next few years, a lot of mind needs to be paid to properly evangelizing and properly catechizing converts. And I think to avoid doing that, I will end up with a generation of Catholics who are effectively nominal.
Yeah.
And normally when you think of your nominal Catholic, you think of like a cradle Catholic who still does it because of routine, not the convert. And even like converts in our generation, you'll hear people talk about it. It's like, oh, they're so passionate, they're so on fire. And it's like, don't mistake the zeal to swing a sword with knowing how to use it. Like those are very, very different things. And I think that lends itself to the method necessary to properly evangelize a culture like the United States and our generation of the United States, because there's not nearly as much of a authority issue as there was with like millennials.
Yeah.
And so people are, by nature of what we've been raised, how we've been raised to handle truth, it'll actually, if people can convince themselves that it's advantageous with the identity they already cling to become Catholic, they'll do it.
Right.
Up until the point that what it means to be Catholic contradicts what it means to be this other identity that they've accrued. Yeah. And then you end up with people like Nick Fuentes, who will proudly display themselves as Catholic and then say something way out of left field.
Yeah.
That, like, okay, yeah, maybe I'm not going to try to throw teaching or church teaching in your face, but there are things that you would imagine the gospel would check your behavior on, and it seems to be not landing with you.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, I don't know the guy personally, but characters like that tend to seem more so like they're using this identity as a way to win favor, or a way to, not favor in general, because obviously
maybe
it's not
get
popular.
In the door too.
Yeah, to be able to on namesake go, no, but like I'm on your team, I'm just like you. And then you say something that I think is wrong, definitively. And in order to avoid that, the way we evangelize, maybe, I could be horribly wrong on this, but in my mind, the way you evangelize that culture, you can't, like, I don't envision a world where such a disparate, hyper-individualistic culture gets a Guadalupe event.
Yeah.
it would have to look fundamentally different.
Yeah.
Especially for young men. Because right now, young, hyper-conservative young men they don't know what to do around a woman, much less the mother of God in some cases. And I think it's going to be one thing that I appreciate Rocco Buglione talking about in his book of the church reclaiming the value of rhetoric, where in the general Western philosophical progression, largely in credit to people like Descartes and these different theories of knowledge, it becomes almost imperative that everything you say coherently demonstrate a one-dimensional point. And that has to be objective, if that's even possible. To the extent that when we read Socrates and the ancient Greeks, and we encounter a rhetorician, we immediately assume dishonesty or just like incoherence. Whereas you have St. Augustine training to be a rhetorician. And the distinguishing a bit being like philosophy is in many ways, or at least when it's treated like that, philosophy is treated like the system of thought. And rhetoric is treated like an aesthetic reduction. That might be true, it might not, you're just trying to sound cool. Where in reality, if done well, rhetoric is the appropriation of this or that philosophy into context. And a lot of those environments where that kind of philosophy, the anti-rhetoric, super like objectivist, fatalist, all that stuff, the culture that was speaking to, they had the benefit of speaking to a whole culture where in many ways objective truth was still a given.
Yeah.
Or speaking to a culture in which they did not have to fear as badly two people from the same town, same age, same ethnicity, same socioeconomic environment, doing fundamentally contradictory things with the same statement. And so the practice and the discipline of being able to sit down with an individual and contextualize objective unifying truth to their subjective experience, such that I'm not writing a thesis and trying to convince you of it. This is part of the reason you have you'll have I know a lot of very smart people in philosophy classes or part of my major or whatever who are horrible at thesis essays. But if you sit there and listen to them talk, they're like the smartest guy in the room. And there's even been moments where I'm like flabbergasted about this guy or that girl speaking so like just off the dome, knowing so much about something. And then you ask him to argue about it systematically, and their brain turns off. And that's because reading a thesis or making an argument like that, I'm immediately putting my listener in a position where they have this or that reaction to my thesis statement. And then when they read my proof, their job now at the end is to decide whether or not they are convinced by every proof, such that their engagement with the information I'm giving them is strictly aesthetic and in a vacuum. Rhetoric is where I can sit down with an individual and I can speak to them on the terms of their experience. Where what I'm actually communicating, if they're able to latch onto it, is transcendent and has far more to do with everything else than it does them.
Yeah.
But it's not insane or unwieldy to acknowledge everything you know confidently, you know because of your experience.
Right.
And if I with our generation and the West in general, I think there's a degree to which I have to make the assumption this person has never had the feeling of transcendent unity and transcendent of like, oh, I'm bigger than just myself.
Yeah.
Because the liberal movement is when I do experience something big, I attribute it to myself. Because every decision that was involved was me. No one was holding my hand. This doesn't map on to some unifying cultural narrative that I see displayed everywhere else. It was displayed to me by the decisions I made. And so now I have to go on chasing a recreation of that transcendence on my own terms.
Yeah.
And trying to will it to happen again. And I think there's a degree to which anyone who seeks to evangelize an environment like that, you have to be able to speak to the individual. And you're effectively introducing a unifying myth to them. And you're asking them to change the terms on which they relate to the world around them. And you have to reanimate, because they're so deeply entrenched in a world without things, a world where everything they do encounter, its being a thing, is dependent on their experiencing it, not the fact that they and their neighbor are experiencing it. So in offering the Catholic worldview, I have to recognize the weight of, I have to convince this person of the universality of a thing. I have to make this person, the world that this person walks into right now, it is only present to them in the moment, and that's assuming that they don't already feel horribly estranged from the world around them. I have to move this person into a understanding of what it means to inhabit a public world that is both for me and the whole. And that is that's not a small movement to make. It's pretty, I would imagine, cumbersome to someone who has to make that significant movement.
Well, that's what we're trying to do right now.
Right.
You know, we're trying to have rhetoric and have this conversation about liberalism, which everybody watching this can see around them. They could see in their church, they could see in their conversations with their friends, with other people, with their parents, the liberalism that is seeping into everybody's minds. And they're going, or like we were going, I can see that. Why is nobody talking about how this is kind of tearing our unity and tearing the church apart? Lastly, I want to go into why liberalism is so popular and why people like subscribe to it so much. Right. The first instance is because it's easy. Liberalism is easy. You can take no objective opinion and leave room for subjection, no dinner party fights, no explicit dogmas, and no line in the sand. You live one way while another lives another, while others live another. There's no headache or time lost trying to convince another. Why would you? It's all subjective. You may even be able to dabble in your own indulgences and be able to make an excuse for them. God said, the Bible, the tradition, etc. Well, I don't subscribe to any of that. It's outdated. We have progressed. Yeah. It's like liberalism is the easy way. My way, their way, no in between. Also, I can make my indulgences available to myself if I can convince myself that, it's not wrong this time. Yeah. I know my pastor said that, but he doesn't even subscribe to things that other churches do. Right. So I can kind of make an excuse for myself here. Do you have anything for that? I can keep going.
Yeah, I think not specifically the pleasures one, but the concept as a whole. Yeah. One of the things I think about, especially thinking about the politics of the real and this idea of like everything is a public thing. When Martin Heidegger talks about being in the world, and there's not a good English translation because he basically invents the word Dasein in German. And so usually the way it's translated is hyphenated, being in the world. Yeah. And rather than, one of the ways he describes it as like readjusting and sort of rejecting the naturalist view that I am a subject in a world of objects, which places me as existing on different terms than everything I find in the world. And if I am willing to make the movement that everything outside of myself is an object, that means I also make an object out of everyone around me. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the reason, like that object or subject-object relation is part of the reason that it's so easy to basically not take another person seriously and attribute any idea or practice that seems to threaten the legitimacy of my own. I can attack it as a static thing. And in doing so, because I don't believe that there's experience or subjectivity applied to the source of that idea, mm-hmm. I lump them together. I make the source the incarnation of the idea. Mm-hmm. And so now I can take out my rage or my disdain on the object that does this to me as simply as I can take out my pain on my couch when I stub my toe. It's equally inconsequential. And so moving into a communal way of seeing the world, to understand things as public things, where I really inhabit the world by engaging with the world, and being able to confidently say, I was made for this world and this world was made for me, and so I can comfortably take up space in this world. And that lends itself to when my cultural presupposition involves the subject-object relation. That means everything about the world is housed, the truth about the world is housed externally to me on terms that I can't comprehend. Mm-hmm. In which case, I can never actually ascertain truth in any meaningful way because we exist on completely different ontological terms. Yeah. Once the community agrees on that, there is now an acceptable standard for how everyone interacts with each other. And it gets to the point where something that in Adam Curtis's documentary, Hypernormalization, we have this idea of being so, the term pops up post-USSR, where the USSR has fallen, but most of the people within its former boundaries don't know what to do now because they've been so incubated, and the degree to which the technocracy was filtering all the information available to them, they are so deprived of an alternative that they don't even know what to do when they had the option to do something else. And part of that is also hearing someone like Mark Fisher or I'm forgetting his colleague's name, but when they talk about this idea of complex information being so dumbed down that, and then an echo chamber just reiterates it to you over and over and over again, normally that echo chamber being the technocracy involved in whatever culture you're a part of. Yeah. One, I come to accept terms that have never been articulated to me. Mm-hmm. Because what I've taken on is a completely contrived version of the information available to me in the world. Yeah. So now, if someone were to ask me what I believe, I could not even articulate it clearly or properly point at what is narrating my worldview, because the version that I've accepted sneaks most of that in. Mm-hmm. Then, even if that mechanism is done away with and dismantled, the only language, terms of existence, whatever social myth I have ever conceived of is one that presumes itself to be a vacuum. Right. And so it then becomes, even though I am free to do otherwise, there's a very real way in which my freedom is denoted by my awareness of an alternative. Mm-hmm. And this is a large part of the Catholic idea of people evangelizing themselves, is because it entrusts a great deal of the evangelistic process to the Holy Spirit, because it sort of takes on this attitude of my responsibility is to, like the Blaise Pascal quote that I love, where he says, the art of revolution and subversion is to probe down to the roots of existing ideologies and show that they lack authority and justice. And then on top of that, to then, once I have demonstrated a lack of authority, I can't just leave it open-ended, because humans are very much habitual creatures, and if we are never offered something more efficient or authoritative or more just, we will return to our vomit. And so my responsibility, and I think this also speaks to the flimsiness of evangelical ministry a lot, is a lot of that is predicated on, I will give you all this information, but no matter what you do with the information, the way I really believe that it worked is if you demonstrate this aesthetic experience. Whereas the alternative is being able to say, that experience and the secret that will exist between you and God is dependent on the Holy Spirit. It doesn't matter what song I play. It doesn't matter how many people are in the sanctuary. It doesn't matter whether we're praying in tongues on the microphone or not. What matters is demonstrating that what you've been in bondage to is done away, it's not authoritative, mm-hmm. and then offering you the alternative. Mm-hmm. That it's like, test this and figure it out, and you will find that it is in fact authoritative.
Yeah.
So I think the reason it's easy is because most people involved in the modern Western way of being, they've never had an alternative articulated. And when they have, it's always through the lens of this thing that we've been liberated from.
Yeah.
Like you look at medieval Europe, and there's a version of history that only refers to Europe as the Dark Ages. And the assumption is, oh, well, that's because the church was in charge. When if you look at why the Dark Ages were actually dark, the church was the only ones doing anything about it. Mm-hmm. And this view of like, you look at medieval history and you hear about this idea of the divine right of kings, and you go, oh my gosh, I can't believe every king thought that God chose them. And it's like, that was like the last 100 years.
Yeah.
That didn't show up until the very end. And in large part, it was due to Enlightenment thought and this separation of church and state that was not present for most of the time.
Yeah.
But because the method of education involved has to assume that we've peaked, then I have to read every other alternative as villainous and oppressive to reaffirm to myself, oh no, this is better. This is better. When in reality, in most cases, in a lot of ways, it's not. And so I think that is the biggest, I feel like the most substantive conversations I've had with our like non-Catholic friends who are in similar positions to us has very little, the boundaries are set out by explaining the differences in doctrine. The substance of coming to know those things is always particular. And like a very clear example of like talking to our friends who are on staff or like in the evangelical system somehow and hearing how exhausted they are with it and how directionless they are with it. And then offering a Catholic worldview as specifically a remedy for the story that they are living in the middle of, like a shift in the narrative. That is where you see like someone really latch onto that stuff.
Yeah.
And so, unfortunately, it's easy because there's no alternative. And that's why the initial step is go to the roots and demonstrate that they lack authority. It's like there's no reason for you to be stuck here. There's no reason for this to feel inescapable because it definitely is.
Yeah.
You have just been deprived of the alternatives that demonstrate so.
Right. The last thing is advancements in life. What I mean by that is finding occupation, being Protestant for 6 years. My talents could be used in a church in some capacity, but now I reject the institution and the principles that they demonstrate. It doesn't just lie there, though. It seeps into every aspect of life. This podcast alone and our adherence to the dogmas of the church that shock culture leave us at a disadvantage. To reject being liberal is an avoidable obstacle that most would stay away from. It can be difficult to overcome if made known, especially in the beginning when no power is held. Some make their opinions known later on but they absolutely must remain dormant until they have power.
Right.
Like Jesus looking out over the kingdoms, one must weigh the options on if he will choose the riches or submit to the throne. Where we are right now, it could be very easy, and we've talked about this, and you've talked about how you had opportunities to go work in the church very easily. Me too. I could work in a church very easily at some capacity, but we have to stand our ground. We can't be liberal in our thought and believe and take things as they are without having a dissenting opinion that we don't believe in.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's kind of a disconnect in churches that have become liberal rather than people that have become liberal in the sense that they're in the workplace or the workforce. You obviously would get more positions that way, but the church, I mean, we saw the Episcopal statistics. It's like they're bleeding members, but they're gaining respect from people that would never walk in there.
Right.
So it's like, what are you doing? You're gaining respect of people who would never go into the church, but you're supposed to be ministering to the people that aren't coming anymore. It's like, why are you doing that? Mm-hmm. But it just comes back to the liberal thought of inclusivity and subjection.
Yeah, I think and we talked about talking about this, but we don't have to go super in depth on it. But one, something that Schindler talks about is this idea that like the normal secular liberal instinct, especially the like up and to the right productivity thing. And it's not new. I mean, you have people in the 1800s criticizing the stereotype of the buttoned up Protestant. And this idea of like the pressure to display everything as neat and orderly outside. And that's all it is, that's fine. Whereas the stereotype you have of the Catholic is they're a mess, but they're devout. And one of the things that Schindler talks about is what liberalism sells you, because it estranges the possibility for goodness from any sense of order, which means it's a matter of my own discovery how I will achieve more and experience more goodness. And the problem is, without the gospel and without the illumination of the Holy Spirit, the most present instinct is to expand beyond my means and to reach out and move up and achieve. The problem is, eventually I will run into the wall where the limits of my means are very real limits, and I will end up quite literally stretching myself too thin. And even though I may or may not take up more space, I've had to make myself thinner to do so. I'm less stable. I'm easy to poke holes in because I've stretched myself so far. Whereas the desire to go out and to fill the world is a Christian, it is an indication of the image of God. But the example we are given of how to do that in Christ and in the saints is almost precisely what Christ does, is rather than making himself larger, which he had every opportunity to do, he willingly made himself smaller. And in making himself smaller, what could have been stretched and extended is now available to show grace and to determine how I treat the other. And so humility affords me grace. Grace allows me to play a consequential, denoted role in the life of the other, to love them and will their good genuinely. And in doing so, I now fill the space occupied by the other, and likewise. So in making myself smaller, I can afford to fill up space in places I could have never reached to. And I think that most things, especially in a world so narrated by like post-Fordist capitalism or consumer capitalism, the idea of willingly making myself smaller for the sake of the other is unthinkable. It's like, why would I do that? I can't risk that. But when you look at, like, obviously you can never measure this, but it's like thinking about what percentage of the most influential people over the last 2,000 years were Christians, like devout Christians. I would tend to argue we occupy more of those spots than any other group. And it's because we are more equipped to occupy space and to take up the world and fill the world. And there was one other thing I was thinking about. Oh, like the being agreeable, the being whatever, which also goes back to like the good Protestant man. Is it's like part of that motivation is if I look good enough on the outside, no one will start asking questions. And two of my favorite people to address that are Soren Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky, where Dostoevsky has this quote of like, man is a mystery that needs to be unraveled. And it's messy, but I care about that unraveling because I care about being a human. And if I try to establish myself as anything other than something that must be unraveled, I will fail to be a human. And it makes me think about in Proverbs where it says the heart of a man is like deep waters, who can know them? But a man of wisdom draws them out. And I think part of that is the benefit of community and the benefit of someone genuinely willing to evangelize you is someone who it's the same idea of like, yes, I have access and the way I relate to the world is rooted in this ultimate truth. But because I care about the ultimate truth, because I've come to love it, I love it everywhere that it appears, which also happens to be everywhere. And so that's where there is in a very real way, especially in a more individualist context with no unification, it's almost essential that for the layman and the clergy to take on a posture of like, I am here to watch you unravel. I'm here to help you watch yourself unravel. The problem is, especially I think in the Bible Belt, it's probably not that much of an issue necessarily in areas that are less intrinsically Protestant, which is funny because the Southeast is the probably most intrinsically Protestant part of the United States. It's also the most increasingly Catholic part of the United States. But there's this is going to start really anecdotal, but I promise it's going somewhere. I remember not even that long ago, like very recently, but for a large part of my young adult life, like I have been preaching on a regular basis since I was 17. And one of my least favorite things in the world is when I would have to find a way to come off humble. When someone would be like, oh, you did such a great job, like da-da-da-da-da. And it was because I felt this pressure to not ever, some of it was personal, just because when I was younger, I was so afraid of like being too much or being overbearing. And so I would try to minimize whatever. But there's also this thing in the Protestant worldview that, and the reason it's not allowed is because it contradicts the relative equal footing nature of what everyone thinks and what everyone does. And so I would preach a sermon that I worked hard on, that I did more research for it and more prep for it than your average Sunday pastor, because I had 2 weeks to preach it instead of 1 week and all that stuff. And through that and through those opportunities, I got to be around for people giving their heart to the Lord, people who had basically abandoned whatever faith they had when they were younger and come back to it. I got to see my friends like get freed from addiction and all these things in the context of events that I organized or got to speak at. And when we would have conversations about like, oh, you did a good job, oh, like you did this for me, or like you played this role in my life, for the longest time I would get so awkward because I would be like, I can't agree too strong, or else I look prideful, or anything like that. And after stepping away from Protestant environments and looking at those positions more and more, and then also just looking at like evangelical circles, and also like having the access that we have to your average evangelical TikToker or whatever, there's this, it never, ever, ever feels sincere. But you have this borderline performative like, man, I'm just being obedient, like da-da-da-da, you can do this too, like all this stuff. And yeah, the all glory, man, that's just him. That's just him.
Thank you, Lord.
And part of that is because I have to continuously assert that whatever goodness is there has nothing to do with the order of my obedience.
Yeah.
I have to estrange goodness from obedience. And that was like the thing I was in. Like I was so careful not to tell anyone that there was anything between where I was in my relationship with the Lord or using this or that gift and where they were. And now looking back at it, I'm like, I realize even things that I had said in the last year, I'm like, that was probably really frustrating for them to hear, because they've just had an experience where they see the Lord use someone in a very tangible way, and they want encouragement. They want the alternative that I seem to be participating in offered to them.
But you're putting yourself on the same field.
But then I diminish the faithfulness that God has when I'm obedient, and I diminish the depths to which He has gone to get them. Mm-hmm. And so it's actually not encouraging, because if someone's really struggling every day and then see someone be used, or someone like any of my friends that became Christian at an event that I was preaching at, and they're like, I want to do that one day. And I go, bro, it's just the Holy Spirit, bro. Then for the rest of however long, their prayers are a gamble of like, can I have this now?
Yeah.
Can I have this now? He said anybody can do it. Can I have this now? And they don't get it.
Yeah.
And then they also never develop the gifts they actually have.
Because they're trying to be you.
Because they're trying to be something else.
Yeah.
Or at least they have no context for what working out their faith with fear and trembling looks like.
Yeah.
And I've already told you this, but I went back home for Thanksgiving this year, or last year, 2025, and I was like going through some old drawers, and I found a bunch of journals of mine that were all from, the earliest one was dated to when I was 11 years old, and the last one dated to when I was 17, 18. And every single page, over 1,000 pages, maybe just under 1,000 pages.
Here you go, you're doing it again.
Oh yeah, but every single one of them was filled with a quote unquote sermon that I was writing. Because for that entire period of my life, I thought I was gonna go be a pastor. And the ones when I was 11, I was just laying in my bed, regurgitating stuff I already heard from other people, and then going to my parents' bedroom and reciting it to my dad. Mm-hmm. And then that slowly turned into like 8 pages of one thing or whatever. And I realize now it's dishonest to, if like when someone comes up and is like, oh dude, like you have a gift, like I'm gonna do that. And I make it out to be the case, like, oh man, that's nothing. You can do it, dude, so, just some things, different gifts for everybody. Every part of the body does a different thing. It just might happen to be the case that my body gets me to go on stage and have people, my part of the body means I get to walk up there and everyone claps for me. Your part of the body means
you clap.
You make coffee and pray for people. And you clap. And all that stuff. And it's like, my part of the body means I have a direct route to a very lucrative career. Your part of the body means you just need to be a good Chipotle worker.
Yeah.
And one, that is more prideful than being able to go, well, dude, like I've had a decade at least of seriously working out stuff with the Lord. You got saved 2 months ago. Mm-hmm. Like let's do this. Let's make stuff happen. Mm-hmm. It also diminishes, in a very real way, the faithfulness and the degree of conviction that 11-year-old me had. Because I just recently turned 21. I am now 10 years separated from a significant amount of my childhood. And I think about that. And one, it's very, because I've moved away from home and I very much am in a position where I'm super separated from that time of my life. And sitting there thinking about 11-year-old me, the first one in there was about this idea of like generational unity. And it was probably like a Tim Keller sermon that I just regurgitated. But I was like, the thought of 11-year-old me sitting there and writing that down and being like, I'm gonna preach this one day. Like this is what matters. And in a lot of ways, like I was reading prayers and stuff that I wrote and they were like convicting me. Yeah. Because I was like, that's intense. Like what was happening at that time that prompted you to say that? Yeah. And so if I pretend like there wasn't a child in the middle of nowhere, South Georgia, for almost 10 years doing that, week in and week out, before I was doing it for 7 years before I ever started preaching them. Yeah. And it's not because I just pulled myself up by the bootstraps. It's because, one, there is the grace that was opportunity, invitation, acceptance that was initiated by the Holy Spirit. And in many ways, like looking back at that, I look at stuff now that I'm like, I'm too hesitant or I don't trust it or whatever. And it's like, what reason did I have rationally to trust that the Lord was going to do something with my 11-year-old notes? I didn't even that wasn't even on my mind. Yeah. It was me just going, we're going to do something with this. Yeah. If someone hands me a microphone, I'm going to talk. Yeah. And then later on, even looking back at times where I was seeing the Lord use things I was saying or sermons that I preached have like a profound effect on someone's life. Even then, I did not think back to the time I was spending with the Lord in middle school. Mm-hmm. It was immediately like, oh, well, that's just the Lord. He's moving. What are you going to do? Yeah. And all that to say, because of that aspect of liberalism, there's this thing that tells me kindness and virtue is directly correlated with a lack of controversy. And so, because I can't afford to seem to invalidate someone else's position, I have to reduce my own. Yep. And what's crazy is you also see this mapped on to the movement that these different schools of thought make with the discovery of the New World, like we were talking about earlier, where the Catholic movement is to say those are men, which means I have to humble my understanding of what a human is. Humans, like in that moment where I think my culture has transcended this ladder, I then have to go back and go, oh no, humans are still making child sacrifices. Humans are still failing to build cities. Humans are still figuring out capital and markets. Humans are still figuring out written language.
Yeah.
And I have to make myself smaller so that I can afford to show grace to these people that would otherwise be like unaddressable. And I also think that's a significant difference you see in North America versus South America. Where South America, yes, there were atrocities that were committed. There were things very quickly got out of order on the imperialist side. And that was part of what the Catholic question about what to do was how do we approach these guys who, when they see someone with our skin color, there were many cases in which when a group of Europeans would show up to villages in South America, those villages had heard what the conquistadors did, and they would just kill themselves in front of the Europeans.
Yeah.
Just as like I have no will to live in light of what you're about to do to me. In North America, or like even after that fact, what was being offered on the religious side in South America was a remedy. And that's why it did take so long for indigenous people to convert, because they didn't trust the people that were arguing, like offering it to them. It took a divine movement in the Holy Spirit for something like the Guadalupe event to happen. Whereas in the United States, the religious side of it is manifest destiny, where actually the thing I'm offering you, I'm not really offering you anything. This is for me, this is my religion. And it's for that reason that you owe me what I'm about to go take from you. Mm-hmm. And the degree to which you see this movement of, I will either make myself smaller, show you grace, and in doing so become larger, and the result being one of the most fervent, devout Catholic communities on the planet, if not the most, you get, well, actually, I'm not going to accept, I'm going to lift myself up. And I'm going to determine that I am a man and you're not a man. And then eventually, that leads to getting stretched so thin where you have Benjamin Franklin writing letters about how Anglo-Saxons are the only real white people and everyone else is inferior.
Yeah.
Like a British guy saying that an Irish guy, Scottish guy, German guy, French guy, Italian guy, most of them probably look mostly indistinguishable. But I'm human, they're not. You see that stretch itself very thin very quickly because of what the state of the United States now. Because you can poke a hole in everything. And that ultimately is dependent on I need to remain, I cannot challenge the norm by any means. I cannot run the risk of this being messy or anyone unraveling. We have to keep everything pinned up and nice. And you ultimately end up depriving people of the alternative that is available in the fullness of the faith, which is, if I sit down, and I've tested this, and I've seen the results vary significantly from what I used to see with other responses, but someone bringing something up, even about the last episode, of someone oh, I listened to you, that was awesome, da-da-da, you guys have such a gift, I'm so proud of you all. And being able to respond with yeah, it's been an interesting journey. I've had to make a lot of concrete decisions with a lack of concrete evidence.
Yeah.
But in acknowledging the very real material and mental hardship of certain decisions that you are visibly, very clearly dependent on the Lord for, I glorify Him. And this reaction of don't even look like you are puffing yourself up or whatever, the only base that has in anything is it is immoral for me to acknowledge that me and this person are currently on different terms, because there's no greater unity that allows them to appreciate the complexity of my experience and the complexity of their experience. If there's nothing more authoritative than this or that accomplishment, then to acknowledge the difference between one of us is cardinal sin. It's not. And then you end up, there's no room for saints.
No.
You can't have someone whose life you look at and go, I want to be that.
Yeah.
And the problem is when no one can articulate something that the next person might be, you don't get an alternative.
Right.
So now, even though these people are living separate lives, some of them doing more than others, some of them taking greater steps and greater leaps than others, you can't say that out loud or attribute it to anyone than this abstract concept of, well, the Spirit does whatever.
Yeah.
Which introduces a need of greater discrepancy because, well, if this is supposed to be like just him, then why is the Holy Spirit using to choose that guy and not me? Rather than stirring up ambition to go, I want that. I want to be that obedient. And then being an opportunity to go, even if the opportunity is not right in front of you, there's a lot that gets accomplished in someone where they can bring themselves to beg the Lord for an opportunity to be obedient. I'm going to do what I got to do, yeah. And I would say like part of that, like thinking that way about those things, for the past 2 years, one of the most, I think, beneficial prayers that I've prayed is just being like, all right, Lord, I really don't trust myself to trust you, but if you are willing to open the door, I will walk through it. Like, I know myself well enough to know that I might find a way to weasel out of it or I might abuse it.
Yeah.
But I would rather run the risk of failing in pursuit of your desires and your heart than succeeding at never doing anything. Yeah. And I think you would see a lot of, especially young people, when you hear a lot of the like super entrenched evangelical young people, they have to speak about everything so abstractly because they have no concept for what it means to make the leap. They don't know that idea that it's like what I do determines who I become. It's like, no. I'm supposed to have everything. I've been baptized, I prayed in tongues that one time, and I take videos of me praying and I post them on TikTok. Like, I'm supposed to have it. And also the feeling of like, well, yeah, but that doesn't sound fair. And it's like, right. Like when you look at Paul's letters and Paul's talking to people a lot about like everything he's done for them, he's responding to people, he's responding to churches he started. He's responding to people who in pretty significant ways were dependent on him for their being evangelized. And when they start acting out of line, Paul's response is like, guys, stop, like we gotta chill. His response is, do you have any idea what I went through for you?
Yeah.
And he's not shy about it. No. None of the saints tend to take that response. And I think that's another area where you look at the massive whole of liberalism or modernity or postmodernity or whatever, and you can see it so evidently in very particular interpersonal actions that whether we realize it or not, even though they feel so small, like it's rare that an individual interaction with someone over 5 minutes feels defining. But every single one of those added up requires whatever aspect of your identity is in relation to the people who know you, it's all added up over the course of your life. Yeah. And you have in many ways set the tone for how you engage with the world around you. And if it's one that's uncomfortable and one that has to obfuscate their language to fit an arbitrary standard of egalitarianism, then you will be fundamentally estranged from everyone you meet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's just, that's liberalism in and of itself.
Right.
I'm subjective. Charity and love, like, I'm going to clothe myself in this idea of charity and love, but actively disobey God by doing so.
Yeah.
And I'm going to take this stance of, everybody can do this, or everybody's fit for that. And we talked about this. Everybody is given equal intrinsic value, but not everybody is on the same playing field.
Yeah.
Not everybody's fit for every situation. That's not how that works. Liberalism can be explained through the simplicity of subjection is the disobedience of God.
Yeah.
Yeah. Praise God.